"Leave the chains," he said. And that was the moment everything she had been taught began to fall apart. The morning air outside the camp felt thinner than usual, sharp with early autumn cold, carrying the faint smell of coal smoke from a town Hannah Keller had never seen. She stood in line with the other women, boots aligned along a chalk mark on the pavement, hands steady at her sides, waiting for the metallic click she had come to expect before any movement beyond the wire. In every story they had whispered to one another, humiliation began with iron. It began with the weight around the ankles, the forced shuffle, the public reminder that you were no longer a citizen of anything but defeat. Captain Robert Harrington stepped out from the administrative building, gloves tucked under one arm, cap set squarely on his head. He looked like any other British officer, pressed uniform, clean lines, a man who measured his words before releasing them. A transport truck idled 20 feet away, engine humming at a low, steady rhythm. Hannah watched the guard's hands. No one carried chains. No one reached for restraints. She felt confusion before relief, and confusion was worse. "No chains," Harrington repeated, calm, almost indifferent, as if he were canceling rain. A murmur moved through the line, barely audible, more breath than sound. The gate opened with a slow mechanical groan, and beyond it lay something she had not prepared for, an ordinary road. Brick row houses stood in neat formation, windows intact, curtains drawn back to the morning light. A milk truck rattled past at maybe 25 miles per hour, its driver glancing only briefly toward the camp. A church bell rang somewhere half a mile away. Life unpaused. Hannah stepped onto the truck bed without assistance. The wood felt solid beneath her boots. She had imagined entering a city as a spectacle, stared at, pointed at, displayed. Instead, the truck rolled forward into narrow streets lined with shops setting out chalkboards and baskets of bread. A woman in a blue coat adjusted her hat against the breeze. Two boys argued over a newspaper headline. No one shouted. No one threw anything. The absence of hostility pressed against Hannah's ribs harder than any iron ever had. She kept her chin level, eyes forward, but she absorbed everything. The shine of rain on cobblestones, the smell of fresh tea drifting from an open cafe door, the ordinary rhythm of a place untouched by the ruin she carried in memory. This, she realized, was the true shock. Not cruelty, not spectacle, just normalcy. Harrington sat across from her in the truck, posture straight, gaze scanning the street with professional caution. At one intersection, a small crowd gathered to watch them pass. Hannah braced herself. Instead of anger, she saw curiosity. A little girl holding her father's hand tilted her head, studying the gray uniforms with solemn interest. The truck slowed to a stoplight. For 3 long seconds, Hannah and the city faced each other without barriers. No chains, no spectacle, just the fragile weight of being seen. And in that silent exchange, something inside her shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. She had expected to be paraded. Instead, she was simply present. And that difference would change everything. The truck continued through the city at a steady pace, its engine humming like a restrained heartbeat, and Hannah felt the strange weight of freedom settling over her shoulders in ways she did not understand. She had prepared herself for stares sharpened into judgment, for whispers thick with accusation, but the faces along the sidewalks held something else entirely. Curiosity, yes. Caution, certainly. But also restraint. A baker stepped out of his shop carrying a tray of fresh loaves, steam rising into the cool air, and paused only long enough to watch them pass before returning inside. A woman adjusted a display of folded scarves in her storefront window. Life did not bend itself around their presence. It continued. The truck turned onto a wider street, perhaps 30 feet across, lined with sycamore trees whose leaves had begun to yellow. Sunlight filtered through branches, scattering moving shadows across the wooden slats beneath her boots. Hannah kept her back straight. She refused to hunch or shrink. If she was to be seen, she would be seen upright. Across from her, Captain Harrington removed his gloves and folded them carefully into his pocket. His eyes moved constantly, measuring distance, scanning rooftops, tracking the flow of pedestrians crossing at corners. He did not look at her often, but when he did, it was brief and uncharged, as though confirming she remained steady. At a red traffic light, the truck came to a gentle stop. The pause stretched longer than expected. A double-decker bus, idled beside them, its windows filled with passengers who turned their heads in near unison. Hannah felt her pulse quicken. She imagined being photographed, recorded, labeled. Instead, a young woman on the bus offered the faintest nod, not approval, not condemnation, simply acknowledgement. The light changed. The truck rolled forward again. They passed a public square where pigeons scattered in a flurry of wings as the vehicle entered. In the center stood a stone fountain, water arching gracefully into a shallow basin. Children ran along its edge, their laughter rising clear and bright. One small boy chased a paper ball too close to the street. It slipped from his hands and skidded beneath the truck's side rail. Without thinking, Hannah leaned down and retrieved it before the wheels could touch it. She held it out through the open side of the truck. The boy froze, eyes wide, uncertain. Captain Harrington gave a slight nod. The boy stepped forward and took the ball from her hand. No words were exchanged. The truck moved on. Hannah sat back, her fingers tingling from the brief contact with something so ordinary. Around her, the other women remained silent, absorbing the same impossible normality. The city did not look like a place eager to degrade them. It looked like a place busy with its own concerns, unwilling to surrender its dignity to spectacle. And in that realization, Hannah felt a quiet shift inside her, something steady and almost unfamiliar, the sense that perhaps the greatest statement made that morning was not spoken at all, but carried in the simple absence of iron. The truck turned toward the river road, where the buildings thinned and the sky opened wide above slate rooftops. And for the first time that morning, Hannah noticed the air smelled faintly of salt and iron, like distant docks. The city had not recoiled from them. It had simply absorbed their presence and continued breathing. That quiet indifference unsettled her more than anger ever could. She had been taught to expect hatred shaped into spectacle. Instead, she found routine. The truck slowed as it approached a narrow bridge, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. Captain Harrington leaned forward slightly, speaking to the driver in a low, measured tone. His voice carried no edge, just clarity. They were not a parade. They were a responsibility. As the truck rolled onto the bridge, Hannah looked down at the water moving beneath, steady and unbothered. The river did not care who crossed above it. It flowed at its own pace, indifferent to uniforms and borders. Halfway across, a gust of wind lifted the edge of her coat. She reached to steady it, and her fingers brushed against the thin camp identification card pinned at her collar. A reminder of status, of category, of limitation. Across from her, Harrington's gaze briefly settled on the card, then shifted away. He did not linger. He did not reduce her to it. That restraint felt deliberate. On the far side of the bridge, the truck entered a marketplace district where vendors arranged crates of apples and potatoes in neat stacks. The driver slowed to nearly 10 miles per hour to avoid pedestrians crossing between stalls. A few shoppers stepped aside, offering space without drama. One elderly man removed his hat as the truck passed, not in deference, not in approval, but in simple habit. Hannah felt something unfamiliar press against her ribs. Respect was not something she expected to witness directed at a moving vehicle full of prisoners. The truck finally pulled into a small municipal courtyard paved with gray stone. A clock tower rose above it, marking the hour at 9 sharp. The engine cut off. Silence settled in layers. Captain Harrington stood first, boots striking the wood with controlled precision. He offered no speech, no display of authority beyond posture. One by one, the women stepped down from the truck without assistance. Their boots met stone instead of mud. Hannah felt the solidity beneath her feet and straightened her spine. Around the courtyard, clerks moved in and out of offices carrying folders and ledgers. Life here functioned on paper and ink, on schedules and signatures, not on spectacle. Harrington approached her position, stopping a respectful distance away. "You will remain together," he said evenly. "You will return together." His words were simple, direct, stripped of embellishment. Not a threat, a framework. Hannah met his eyes for a brief second. Blue, steady, measuring, but not diminishing. She gave the smallest nod, not submissive, not defiant, simply acknowledging shared understanding. In that courtyard, beneath a clock that did not pause for anyone, she realized something that unsettled her more than fear. The absence of chains had not been an oversight. It had been a decision. And decisions like that did not happen by accident. The clock tower struck once more, a hollow metallic note that seemed to settle into the stone beneath Hannah's boots. The courtyard did not quiet for them because it had never grown loud in the first place. Clerks crossed the open space with folders tucked under their arms, shoes tapping against the pavement in steady rhythm. A man in a brown coat unlocked a side door and disappeared inside without a second glance. The world here functioned on habit, not hostility. Hannah stood with the other women in a straight line, hands loosely folded in front of her, shoulders level. No guard hovered inches away. No one reached for restraints. The absence of physical control forced a different kind of discipline. She understood that now. Captain Harrington moved a few feet ahead of them and spoke briefly with a municipal officer who carried a leather binder pressed to his chest. Their exchange was quiet, efficient, marked by small nods. Papers changed hands. A pen scratched across a page. The business of accountability, conducted in daylight. Hannah watched the pen more closely than the men. Ink, not iron. Signatures, not shackles. When Harrington turned back toward the group, his expression remained composed, but there was a subtle tightening at the corner of his mouth, the look of a man who had accepted responsibility and would not retreat from it. "You will accompany me inside," he said evenly. "You will answer what is asked. Nothing more." His tone carried neither suspicion nor sympathy, only structure. They crossed the courtyard together, boots echoing lightly beneath the archway of the municipal building. Inside, the air shifted cooler, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and paper. A narrow corridor stretched ahead, lined with framed notices and neatly printed schedules. Hannah's reflection appeared briefly in the glass of a bulletin board. Gray uniform, pale face, eyes alert. She held that reflection for half a second, measuring herself against the setting. She did not look like a spectacle. She looked like a visitor who did not belong but would not shrink. In a small office, a clerk behind a wooden desk glanced up as they entered. His gaze lingered only long enough to confirm numbers and faces. "Processing for supervised labor visit," Harrington stated clearly. The clerk nodded and began recording names with careful handwriting. One by one, the women stepped forward when called. When Hannah heard her name spoken aloud in accented English, she moved without hesitation. She spelled it slowly, distinctly. The clerk repeated it back, adjusting a letter, then corrected himself with a polite apology. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it carried a weight far greater than its length. She had been addressed, not displayed, addressed. When she stepped aside, she noticed Harrington watching the interaction from near the doorway, not intruding, observing, ensuring. Outside the window, the city continued at its measured pace. A delivery cart rolled past at perhaps 8 miles per hour. A woman adjusted the strap of her handbag. A dog paused to inspect a lamppost. Ordinary movements. Ordinary dignity. Hannah realized that what unsettled her most was not the kindness itself, but the restraint embedded within it. They were not being elevated. They were not being humiliated. They were being handled within a system that chose order over spectacle. And in that choice, something quietly radical had taken place. The chains had not been forgotten. They had been deliberately left behind. When they stepped back into the courtyard, the light had shifted slightly, softer now, angled across the stone in long pale bands. The clock read 9:23, 23 minutes inside a building, and yet the world felt fractionally different. The women reassembled instinctively into a straight line, boots aligned, shoulders squared. No one had ordered them to do so. Discipline had become internal. Captain Harrington emerged last, a folder tucked beneath his arm. He paused just long enough to survey the square before giving a single nod to the driver. The truck waited where it had been left, engine quiet, as if confident it would not be needed in haste. As they crossed the courtyard once more, a pair of municipal workers wheeled a cart stacked with parcels past them at perhaps 5 miles per hour. One of the parcels slipped, tilting dangerously toward the edge. Hannah reacted before thinking, stepping forward to steady the stack with her palm. The worker caught it at the same moment. For a fraction of a second, their hands hovered inches apart. He looked at her directly, not with alarm, not with disdain, but with surprise at the reflex. "Thank you," he said automatically, the words simple and unguarded. Hannah inclined her head once and stepped back into line. The exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, yet it carried the quiet gravity of recognition. Harrington had seen it. She knew because when she glanced toward him, his expression had altered almost imperceptibly. Not softened, not warmed, adjusted, as though a calculation had been revised. They climbed back onto the truck without instruction, though it felt less foreign beneath her boots now. The city noise resumed around them in steady layers. The distant hum of a bus engine, the sharp ring of a bicycle bell, the murmur of conversation drifting from a shop doorway. Nothing rose to meet them in accusation. Nothing pressed down in spectacle. The truck pulled away from the courtyard at a measured speed, perhaps 15 miles per hour, merging back into the ordinary flow of traffic. Hannah watched the clock tower recede behind them, its hands continuing their patient rotation. Time here moved without reference to her captivity. That realization stung in a way she could not fully name. She had imagined that stepping beyond the camp would expose cruelty or chaos. Instead, it exposed proportion. She was not the center of this city's story. She was a passing detail. Across from her, Harrington rested one hand against the side rail, steady against the vibration of the engine. He did not speak. He did not need to. The absence of commentary felt deliberate, allowing the moment to settle without distortion. As they approached the bridge again, the river below reflected a band of pale sky. Hannah noticed her breathing had slowed. Her shoulders had lowered by inches. The most startling part of the morning was no longer the lack of restraints. It was the realization that dignity, once offered, demanded something in return. She could not control the uniform she wore. She could control the way she stood within it. And in the steady roll of the truck back toward the camp gates, that quiet understanding felt heavier than iron ever had. The truck crossed back over the bridge at a steady 20 miles per hour, and the river below looked unchanged, as if the morning had made no impression on it at all. Hannah watched the water slide past the stone embankments and felt the quiet return of gravity inside her chest. The city receded behind them, not in anger, not in relief, simply in distance. On the far side of the bridge, the streets narrowed. Again, brick giving way to gravel, storefront glass replaced by warehouse walls, and finally the familiar outline of fencing rising against the pale sky. The camp gates came into view without drama. No crowd waited. No announcement marked their return. The truck slowed, tires crunching softly over loose stone, and rolled through the open entrance. For a brief second, as they passed from city road back into controlled ground, Hannah braced herself for correction, for some symbolic reclaiming of authority. None came. The engine cut. Captain Harrington stepped down first, then turned slightly to ensure the women dismounted in order. They climbed from the truck without assistance, boots meeting the packed earth inside the perimeter. The wire above them cast thin shadows across the ground, lines intersecting like quiet reminders of structure. Harrington spoke to the gate sergeant in low tones, offering the signed folder from the municipal office. The sergeant skimmed the top page, nodded once, and returned it. No reprimand. No debate. Just acknowledgement that the procedure had been completed and responsibility had been carried. Hannah stood in line with the others, aware of the shift in atmosphere. Inside the camp, movement was measured, contained. Outside, it had been layered and spontaneous. Yet she felt no smaller here than she had beyond the gates. That was new. As they were dismissed back toward their barracks, a few other prisoners glanced up from assigned tasks. Their expressions held questions unspoken. Hannah met those looks steadily. She did not embellish the experience with gestures or whispered dramatics. She simply walked. Across the yard, Captain Harrington removed his cap for a moment, running a hand through his hair before replacing it with practiced precision. The gesture was small, almost private, but it revealed the strain of choice more clearly than any speech could have. He had decided that morning to rely on order instead of spectacle. That decision had traveled through streets, across a bridge, into a municipal office, and back again without fracture. Hannah reached the doorway of her barracks and paused just long enough to look back at the gate. From this angle, the world beyond it seemed narrower, framed by wire and posts. Yet she knew now that beyond those lines stood brick houses, clock towers, market stalls, and a river that did not alter its course for uniforms. She inhaled slowly, the air carrying the scent of earth and distant smoke. The absence of chains had been visible. The deeper change was not. It lived in posture, in restraint, in the understanding that dignity, once extended, did not vanish when the gates closed. It followed her inside, quiet and unannounced, settling somewhere firm within her spine. The barracks door closed behind Hannah with a soft wooden thud, muting the distant sounds of the yard into a low, steady hum. Inside, the air felt warmer, faintly carrying the scent of wool blankets and soap. The other women moved to their bunks without speaking, each absorbed in her own recalibration. Boots were unlaced, jackets folded, metal bed frames creaked under shifting weight. Hannah remained standing for a moment longer, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her bunk, as if confirming its solidity. Nothing in the room had changed. The same narrow windows, the same whitewashed walls, the same measured routine. And yet the morning had altered the space in a way no one could point to. One of the younger prisoners, Elise, glanced toward her with a question in her eyes. "Were they watching us?" she asked quietly. Hannah considered the question before answering. "They were living," she said. The distinction mattered. Watching implied spectacle. Living implied proportion. Elise absorbed the answer and looked down at her hands. Outside, a whistle sounded somewhere across the compound, signaling the next scheduled task. Time resumed its prescribed rhythm. Hannah sat on the edge of her bunk and removed her boots slowly, setting them side by side beneath the frame. Across the aisle, a woman unfolded a small scrap of paper and began writing in careful script, recording impressions before they faded. Hannah did not write. She replayed details instead. The way the municipal clerk corrected the spelling of her name with quiet apology. The way the market worker had said thank you without hesitation. The way Captain Harrington had stood just far enough away to allow space, but close enough to guarantee order. These were not grand gestures. They were measured ones. In the yard beyond the window, she could see Harrington crossing toward the administrative building, folder still in hand. His stride was even, shoulders squared, the posture of a man who would answer questions if asked. He did not look back toward the barracks. He did not seek acknowledgement. That absence of self-display felt intentional. Hannah lay back against the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling beams. She had spent months preparing for degradation, constructing emotional armor against mockery and restraint. She had not prepared for neutrality. Neutrality required composure. It demanded that she carry herself as though she belonged in any space she entered, even one bordered by wire. The whistle sounded again, closer this time. Work assignments would begin shortly. Routine would reclaim the day. Hannah rose, smoothed the front of her uniform, and braided a loose strand of hair back into place. As she stepped outside into the yard, the light had shifted higher, shadows shortening under the late morning sun. A few prisoners glanced at her again, searching for some dramatic account. She offered none. She simply took her place in formation. Across the yard, Captain Harrington paused near the gate, speaking briefly with another officer whose brow furrowed as he reviewed the signed papers. There would be questions. There would be opinions. Hannah watched the exchange without tension. The decision had already been made. The morning had already happened. And somewhere between a bridge and a clock tower, a quiet standard had been set, one that did not require applause to endure. By early afternoon, the camp had returned to its measured rhythm, but the morning lingered in subtle ways that no schedule could erase. Hannah stood in the supply yard sorting folded linens onto a wooden cart, the fabric cool and slightly rough beneath her fingers. The task was ordinary, repetitive, almost calming. Yet every so often her mind drifted back to the bridge, to the market stalls, to the quiet nod of a stranger who had not looked at her as an object of spectacle. Around her, other women worked in near silence. A few exchanged brief whispers, their voices low and contained, as though speaking too loudly might disturb whatever fragile shift had occurred. The sky above the compound was pale blue, the sun high enough now to cast short, sharp shadows beneath the watch posts. Captain Harrington crossed the yard with deliberate steps, stopping near the administrative office where two other officers waited. Their posture suggested inquiry rather than accusation. Papers were unfolded. Pages were examined. One officer gestured toward the gate, as if tracing the morning's route in the air. Harrington listened without interruption. His chin remained level. His responses were brief, measured, impossible to overhear from a distance. Hannah did not strain to catch the words. She focused instead on the steadiness of his stance. No defensiveness. No apology. Only clarity. After several minutes, the other officers nodded and dispersed, each returning to separate duties. Harrington remained where he stood for a moment longer, eyes following the path toward the gate before turning back toward the yard. When his gaze passed over the workers, it did not linger. It acknowledged and moved on. That, too, felt intentional. Later, as the afternoon bell signaled a short break, Hannah carried the cart toward the storage shed at the edge of the compound. The gravel crunched softly beneath the wheels, the sound crisp in the still air. Near the shed door, she paused to adjust the stack that had shifted slightly. The simple act required balance, attention, care. She realized that the morning had given her something unexpected, a renewed sense of proportion. She was still confined. The fence still marked the boundary of her movement. Yet beyond that fence lay a city that had chosen not to degrade her for crossing it. That knowledge altered the weight of the present moment. It did not dissolve it. It steadied it. As she returned the empty cart to its place against the wall, a breeze moved through the yard, lifting dust in a thin, swirling line. Somewhere beyond the compound, a train whistle echoed faintly, carrying across open fields. Life extended outward in all directions, indifferent and persistent. Hannah stood still for a second longer than necessary, letting the sound fade. Dignity, she understood now, was not a reward granted at the end of conflict. It was a standard set in small, deliberate decisions. Decisions like leaving iron behind. Decisions like signing a name in ink rather than fastening a lock. When the work bell rang again, she stepped back into line without hesitation, posture straight, eyes forward. The morning had not made her freer in distance. It had made her freer in bearing. And that difference would endure long after the sound of the city had faded from memory. The afternoon light thinned gradually, turning from pale gold to a muted gray that settled over the compound like a quiet curtain. Work details concluded in measured steps. Tools were returned. Lists were checked. Names were marked off in ink. Hannah rinsed her hands in a metal basin. Outside the supply shed, watching the dust swirl away in faint cloudy ribbons before the water cleared again. The simplicity of the motion grounded her. Across the yard, Captain Harrington stood near the administrative building speaking with the camp sergeant once more, the same folder now resting beneath his arm, as if it had become part of his uniform. Their exchange was shorter this time. Fewer gestures. Fewer questions. Procedure, once established, tended to settle into acceptance. The evening bell rang at precisely 5 o'clock. The sound carried cleanly across the perimeter, echoing briefly against the wire before fading into open air beyond. Prisoners formed lines without instruction, boots aligning along the same chalk marks as the morning. Hannah noticed how different the line felt now. The posture remained disciplined, but the tension had eased by degrees. She did not feel watched in anticipation of misstep. She felt accounted for. That distinction altered her breathing. As the final roll call concluded, the gates were secured with the familiar mechanical clank, yet the sound no longer struck her with the same finality. Beyond those gates lay a bridge, a river, a market square, and a clock tower that had marked 9:23 without hesitation. Those images remained vivid, not as fantasies, but as evidence. Inside the barracks, supper trays were distributed with routine efficiency. Tin cups clinked softly against wooden tables. Conversation remained low, subdued, but no longer edged with disbelief. Elise leaned closer to Hannah and asked quietly, "Do you think it will happen again?" Hannah paused before answering. "It already happened once," she said evenly. Probability did not need embellishment. After the meal, the women returned their trays and prepared for the night. Outside, the sky deepened into a cool blue, the first faint star visible above the far corner of the fence. Hannah stepped briefly to the narrow window beside her bunk and looked outward. A single guard paced along the perimeter at a steady interval, boots striking earth in consistent rhythm. Order remained intact. Nothing had loosened beyond control, and yet the standard had shifted. She thought of Harrington's steady posture in the courtyard, the municipal clerk correcting a letter in her name, the worker's automatic thank you. These were not grand gestures. They were calibrations. That word lingered with her. A calibration of expectation. A recalibration of what authority could look like when it chose composure over spectacle. As lights out approached, the barracks dimmed to a softer shade. Blankets rustled. Breathing slowed. Hannah lay back and folded her hands over her chest, eyes tracing the shadowed beams above. The camp had not changed in structure. The fences stood. The schedules held. But somewhere between a clock tower and a set of market stalls, a quiet decision had been made, and it had returned with her through the gate. Dignity had crossed the bridge that morning without escort, and it had not been stopped at the wire. Night settled fully over the compound, and with it came a quieter kind of clarity. The barracks had gone still except for the soft cadence of breathing and the occasional shift of fabric against metal frames. Hannah remained awake, eyes open in the darkness, tracing the faint outline of the window where a thin strip of moonlight cut across the floor. The events of the morning did not replay as spectacle. They replayed as fragments. A bridge railing beneath her palm. The clock striking 9:23. The word "thank you" spoken without hesitation. Across the yard, in a separate building lit by a single desk lamp, Captain Harrington reviewed the same folder once more before placing it into a locked cabinet. His movements were methodical. Kept set down, gloves aligned beside it, a pen placed carefully into its holder. He paused for a moment with his hand resting on the cabinet door, as if weighing something not written on the pages inside. Decisions made in daylight rarely ended there. They echoed into policy, into precedent, into quiet conversations behind closed doors. Earlier that evening, another officer had asked him whether it had been necessary to avoid restraints beyond the gate. The question had not carried accusation, only inquiry shaped by habit. Harrington had answered in measured tone. Necessary was not always the correct word. Appropriate was. The distinction lingered in the air long after the conversation ended. Back in the barracks, Hannah turned onto her side, facing the narrow window. The fence line beyond it was barely visible, a faint geometry against the darker sky. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps a mile away, a train passed along unseen tracks, its low rumble threading through the night before fading. Movement beyond confinement. Not dramatic, not defiant, simply continuous. She realized that what had unsettled her most that morning was not the kindness itself, but the absence of humiliation. There had been no grand speech about mercy, no symbolic gesture demanding gratitude, only a quiet refusal to reduce her to a display. That refusal required strength of its own. Strength not expressed through force, but through restraint. In the administrative building, Harrington extinguished the desk lamp and stepped outside into the cool night air. The yard lay still under the moon, shadows stretching long beneath the watch posts. He walked a slow circuit along the interior path, boots striking earth in even rhythm. When he reached the gate, he paused briefly, resting his hand against the cold metal latch. Beyond it lay the road, the bridge, the city that had absorbed their presence without incident. Inside lay order, accountability, and the weight of command. He did not appear conflicted. He appeared resolved. Back in the barracks, Hannah finally closed her eyes. She understood now that dignity was not granted in grand declarations. It was constructed in ordinary decisions, reinforced by repetition, sustained by those willing to stand by them when questioned. The fence had not moved. The perimeter had not widened. Yet something intangible had crossed it that morning and returned intact. And in the quiet between heartbeats and distant train echoes, that realization settled deeper than any boundary could contain. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale gray light seeping through the barracks window and stretching across the floorboards in narrow bands. Hannah woke before the bell, her eyes adjusting slowly to the quiet geometry of beams and bunks. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the fence line beyond the glass returned to focus, thin and precise against the sky. She sat up, folding her blanket with deliberate care, smoothing each corner until it aligned perfectly with the edge of the mattress. Routine, when chosen, felt different from routine imposed. Outside, a light mist hovered close to the ground, softening the outlines of the yard. Captain Harrington was already awake. He stood near the administrative building reviewing the day's assignments, a clipboard balanced against his palm. A junior officer approached him with a question, voice low but urgent. From a distance, Hannah could see the shift in posture. The younger man gestured toward the outer gate, perhaps referencing regulations, perhaps proposing stricter measures. Harrington listened without interruption, his expression composed. When he answered, he did. So without raising his voice. The conversation ended not in visible tension, but in understanding. The junior officer gave a brief nod and moved away, his stride no longer rigid. The bell rang at precisely 6 o'clock, the sound crisp in the cool air. Prisoners formed lines once more, boots finding their marks in the gravel. Hannah noticed the way she stepped forward this time. Not braced, not defensive, simply aligned. As roll call concluded, Harrington walked the length of the formation, not inspecting as much as observing. His gaze passed over each face evenly, pausing only long enough to confirm presence. When his eyes met Hannah's, the exchange lasted no more than a heartbeat. It held neither familiarity nor distance. It held recognition of shared accountability. The morning assignments were announced, and Hannah was directed toward the records shed to assist with inventory tallies. Inside, the room smelled faintly of ink and paper, the wooden shelves stacked neatly with labeled boxes. She recorded quantities carefully, writing numbers in steady script. Outside the open door, the compound moved with quiet coordination. The decision made the previous day had not unraveled order. It had reinforced it. Mid-morning, a messenger arrived from headquarters carrying an envelope sealed with official insignia. He handed it directly to Harrington, who broke the seal with measured precision. His eyes scanned the page, pausing briefly before continuing. There was no visible reaction, only a slight tightening of his jaw that relaxed just as quickly. He folded the letter once and placed it inside his jacket pocket. Whatever the contents, they did not alter his stance. Hannah observed from across the yard, sensing that policy, like dignity, required reinforcement through repetition. A single act did not define a standard. Consistency did. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last trace of mist, the fence cast sharp, unwavering lines across the ground. Inside those lines, structure remained firm. Beyond them, a city continued its measured pace. And between those two spaces stood a man who had chosen restraint over spectacle and a woman who had chosen posture over bitterness. Neither sought acknowledgement. Neither required applause. The shift had already taken root, quiet and resilient, anchored not in defiance, but in composure. The letter remained in Captain Harrington's jacket pocket throughout the afternoon, a quiet weight against his chest as the camp moved through its prescribed hours. Hannah noticed the difference not in his posture, but in his stillness. He spoke less, observed more. Decisions, once written, tended to travel upward before they returned. The question was never whether they would return. It was in what form. By midday the sun had warmed the gravel paths, drawing the faint scent of dust into the air. Hannah continued her inventory work inside the records shed, the scratch of pencil against paper steady and precise. Numbers aligned in careful columns. Accuracy, she had learned, was another form of dignity. Outside, a vehicle approached the outer gate, its tires rolling slowly over packed earth. Not the municipal truck from the day before. A darker car, polished, official. Two men stepped out wearing tailored coats and expressions shaped by evaluation rather than routine. Their eyes scanned the perimeter first, then the yard, absorbing structure before seeking individuals. Harrington walked to meet them without haste. He removed his cap briefly in acknowledgement and extended his hand. The exchange was formal, contained within gestures that revealed nothing to onlookers. The men requested to see the records. Harrington gestured toward the administrative office and led them inside. From her position near the shed doorway, Hannah could not hear the conversation, but she observed its tempo. Pages turned. A pen tapped lightly against a desk. At one point, one of the visitors stepped toward the window overlooking the yard and watched the prisoners at work. His gaze lingered not in accusation, but in assessment. Harrington stood beside him, not defensive, not apologetic. Steady. After nearly 20 minutes, the men emerged once more. Their expressions had not hardened. If anything, they had settled into neutrality. One of them nodded slightly toward Harrington before returning to the car. The vehicle departed as quietly as it had arrived. The gate closed behind it with the same measured sound it had always made. Nothing dramatic followed. No announcement. No alteration of routine. Yet the air in the yard felt subtly clearer, as if a question had been posed and answered without escalation. Later, as the afternoon light began to angle westward, Harrington crossed the yard toward the records shed. He paused at the doorway where Hannah stood reviewing her final tally. Accuracy matters, he said evenly, glancing at the columns of figures. It was not a compliment. It was recognition. Hannah met his gaze briefly. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice calm. No further words were required. He stepped away, continuing his circuit along the perimeter. The fence remained exactly where it had been the day before. The watch post stood unchanged. Yet somewhere between a signed letter and a returned inspection, a precedent had begun to take shape. Not loud, not celebrated, simply affirmed through repetition. As the late afternoon bell signaled the closing of work details, Hannah set down her pencil and closed the ledger carefully. Outside, the sky stretched pale and open beyond the wire. Authority had been tested not through force, but through scrutiny. And composure, once again, had held. The sun lowered slowly behind the outer fence, casting long amber lines across the yard that stretched almost 12 feet before dissolving into shadow. Evening returned without spectacle, just as it had the day before. Hannah stood near the records shed as the final assignments were cleared, watching the light fade across gravel and wire. The inspection had come and gone. The questions had been asked. The answers had held. Nothing in the structure of the camp had shifted, yet something quieter had settled into place. Captain Harrington stood near the gate once more, hands clasped behind his back, gaze directed outward toward the road that led to the bridge and the city beyond. He did not look triumphant. He did not look relieved. He looked resolved. Authority, when steady, did not require visible victory. It required endurance. The evening bell rang at 5:30, its tone softer now in the cooling air. Prisoners formed lines as they always had, boots aligning with practiced precision. Hannah felt the gravel beneath her feet, solid and unchanged. She understood that the fence still marked the limits of her movement. Yet the measure of her worth no longer felt confined by its height. Roll call concluded without incident. Names were spoken, presence confirmed, dismissed. As she turned toward the barracks, a faint breeze moved through the compound, lifting dust into the light before letting it settle again. Ordinary motion, ordinary air. Inside the administrative building, Harrington placed the returned inspection letter into a locked drawer, the click of metal quiet but decisive. He extinguished the overhead lamp and stepped outside into the dusk. For a brief moment, his eyes traced the perimeter, then lifted beyond it to where the sky opened wide above the unseen river. He had not changed policy with a speech. He had not altered order with force. He had simply chosen not to humiliate when he could have. That choice, repeated and defended, had become precedent. In the barracks, Hannah folded her jacket carefully and set it at the foot of her bunk. Elise glanced toward her with unspoken curiosity, but no words were necessary. The proof was not in retelling. It was in posture. Hannah lay back and closed her eyes as the room dimmed. She understood now that dignity did not arrive with applause. It arrived quietly, in measured decisions made by those who could have chosen otherwise. Beyond the fence, a city continued its steady rhythm. Within the wire, order remained intact. Between those two spaces stood a standard that neither noise nor doubt had overturned. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand recognition. She simply stood straight when given the chance. And in doing so, she had not changed the fence. She had changed the meaning of standing behind it.